Señoras y señores, muy buenas tardes. Espero se encuentren muy bien y bienvenidos a Colombia 4.0, el encuentro de los grandes ecosistemas de innovación digital organizado por el Ministerio de Tecnologías de la Información y las Comunicaciones. Esta cumbre hace parte de la estrategia Potencia tu vida, Potencia Digital, en la cual buscamos la transformación de diferentes regiones apartadas del país en cabeza de nuestro ministro TIC, Mauricio Liscano. Durante los siguientes días vamos a encontrar diferentes agendas académicas como videojuegos, animación, IGTech, HealthTech, EdTech, BogTech, inteligencia artificial y tecnologías disruptivas de la cuarta revolución industrial. En este momento vamos a hablar acerca de The Ladies of Mission Mental Health. Para quienes necesiten el apoyo del idioma, pueden encontrar acá diferentes equipos, los cuales pueden utilizar para comprender la charla en su totalidad. Y sin más que decir, dejo al equipo del doctor Bechara Saab que empiece con su charla. Muchas gracias.
Hi, everybody. It's very much a pleasure to be here. My name is Dr. Bechara Saab. I'm the CEO and the chief scientist of a company called Mobio Interactive. We focus on precision psychiatry. Now, I classically trained as a chemist and then did a PhD in neuroscience. And during my PhD, I started to get very interested in the parts of the brain that are important for the motivation to explore. Curiosity, what makes us curious. And I was fortunate to make some important discoveries in that domain, and then continued after my PhD to open my own laboratory at the Zurich Psychiatry Hospital. And when I was there, I really focused on finding out how we could artificially, manually interact with this circuitry. We had very invasive, very advanced neuroscientific techniques that allowed us to specifically control different neurons in the brain in order to control the behavior of animals. And we found that if we would selectively drive exploration in novel environments, we could rescue some endophenotypes, some symptoms of depression in animals that really led me to think there might be an opportunity here inside of mental health for humans, if we could translate this type of research. Because if you look across the different aspects of mental illness, you'll find that very commonly there's a dearth of exploratory behaviors. People with schizophrenia and anxiety tend to lack exploratory drive because they're too afraid. And people with depression have anhedonia. They don't get the pleasure that they normally get out of things, and so they too do not explore with the same level of curiosity. And the question is, could we devise some way in order to start this circuitry on its own and then relieve some symptoms of mental illness? And the answer was yes, at least in the laboratory. Now, at the same time, many of my colleagues who were clinicians at the hospital, they were making very important decisions in the treatment for patients without having access to the very detailed type of objective data that I used in my preclinical laboratory. And that really frustrated me, and I saw this as a major issue. And it is, in fact, a major issue. We know that mental illness is the greatest burden in all of health. It's the largest contributor to lost economic opportunity, and it's probably the largest reason why we fail to advance our human flourishing. It's difficult when you don't feel well to perform well, exceptionally difficult. And it's a massive issue, and it's increasing. Even before the pandemic, the incidence and prevalence of mental illnesses, particularly affect disorders like major depression, were increasing, and really increasing a lot in youth, more than so in adults, and particularly older adults. So it's a massive pressing issue, but it has a major problem. The major problem is really related to the data. We can get objective data in healthcare on our genes, on our epigenome, on circulating hormones, heart function, etc. But in psychiatry and mental health care, the data that we need are about how we feel. So how do we get objective data on how we feel? How do we remove the subjectivity from the practice of psychiatry? Is this something that's possible? First, I want to articulate a bit about the current state of how things are. In mental health care, we measure how patients are doing with psychological scales, often called medical questionnaires. And these medical questionnaires have major limitations, which prohibit the advancement of this entire field of medicine. There's a temporal limitation where we can only really ascertain what's happening in a patient every 2 weeks or every month. And that's because we measure them and ask them questions about what has happened in their past. It's retrospective analysis. It's not real time. It also takes at least 5 minutes to fill out a survey, which makes it very difficult to do these things in real time. Another big limitation is ethnological, where different psychological scales are really only appropriate for particular ethnicities or particular personality types within an ethnicity, or for certain genders, socioeconomic backgrounds, different ages, etc. So it's very difficult for us to get large data sets that represent the situation for the entire population, especially across different countries, if we rely on these sorts of data. And then finally, and most obviously, psychological scales are biased. There's many different types of biases. And of course, it's difficult as a psychiatrist or psychologist to know if your patient is being honest with you or even if they're being honest with themselves. I think all of us are guilty, absolutely myself, of not being honest with ourselves about what we truly feel or why we feel the way we do. Often I'm angry and I won't admit it, and often I won't actually discuss or tell anybody about the reasons why I'm sad. And then these sorts of biases work their way into the data for the healthcare physician and corrupt our ability to deliver good treatment. So while there's been immense progress across the field of medicine, think about the amazing achievements that we've done. Polio being eradicated, HIV is no longer a death sentence. Over 50% of people with a cancer diagnosis will receive a positive prognosis at some point that they will survive. Most people beat cancer. That wasn't the case a few years ago. This is a novel thing which is credited to modern medicine and our ability to adapt. But in mental health care, the situation continues to get worse and our ability to treat is not improving. This is a failure for my community and we need to do better. And I think that the way to do better is to treat the brain like an organ. This is a picture of the body, many different organs, and the brain is just one of those organs. We need to abandon this notion of mind-brain duality, this concept that our mind is separate from our brain, that how we feel in our consciousness is somehow living on a different plane. No, the way that you feel is a direct result of neurochemistry inside of your brain. That's a simple fact. The brain is an organ. We need to treat it like an organ in medicine. And we know a lot about it. When I started my PhD 20 years ago, we didn't know nearly as much as we know now. And the explosion of understanding is absolutely increasing at breakneck pace. We have a good understanding about what the brain looks like neurochemically, neurobiologically, when you feel good, when you're stoked about something, when you're experiencing a high degree of psychological stress. We understand these things and we should be able to measure them objectively. And if we do so, I can see us having the same type of improvements in psychiatry and mental health care more broadly that we've witnessed in other fields of medicine. And AI is something that can allow us to do that. These are complex problems, and AI is very good at finding solutions to complex problems that we ourselves, as scientists and clinicians, have failed to do so. And there's different ways of doing it, but think a little bit about how we understand how other people feel. You can look at somebody, just look at somebody, and get an idea for how they feel. Well, that is possible because your brain is acting as a tool to understand information about what that person is doing, particularly their face and their body language, different sorts of behavior. So if the human brain is able to ascertain information about other people, then perhaps we can train a computer to do this in an unbiased way, completely objectively. Now, I think it'd be great if it's possible for us to have a little bit of a discussion. And I'm going to do my best to try to not take up the entire 45 minutes speaking. And I want you to be able to think about potential questions that you might ask during the course of this talk, and then afterwards we can have that discussion. Any question is a fine question, and I'll be delivering a very high-level overview of many of these concepts. So please feel free to dive deeper into something that you find personally interesting, something you're curious about on your own. Now, the places where we can make good progress, I've divided into a few different domains. We can do direct measurements of the brain. This is the ideal scenario. Measure exactly what's happening in the brain, use that information as feedback on how patients are doing, how they're responding to therapy, etc. It's really ideal, but it's very hard to scale. The tools that we have to do this are not scalable, and they're currently very expensive. So there's massive challenges with a direct measurement approach. A second approach, which holds good promise, is examining the behavior. Now, this is not truly an objective measure of different brain states, but it's functionally important, because what matters for each of us when we have a mental illness is ultimately how we are behaving. That matters for us, that matters for the people around us. Are we able to operate at a good capacity? And we can measure behavior in objective ways quite well. And then the third is interoception. This is the process where you understand how you feel. Well, you sense your own body. If your heart is pounding very fast, you get the sense that you're nervous about something. If you're breathing very slowly, you get the sense that you're calm. So there's all these opportunities for us to sense our bodies in order for us to understand what's going on in our bodies and in our minds. You know that funny feeling you get in your gut before you go on stage and you get nervous? This is a process of interoception, which is very important. And we have the capacity to measure these sorts of things as well, objectively, using tools that can leverage AI in order to produce a result that is medically relevant. So for direct measurements, I want to focus in on fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, because there's already been really good progress in showing how when you use fMRI, you can directly measure different processes in the brain that can be used to diagnose various mental health conditions. Schizophrenia and how people respond to different emotional cues and even just different types of visual cues is one example where AI has been applied to the fMRI data in order to ascertain how is the brain different. And these sorts of computations are extremely difficult to do with rule-based systems or other algorithms. We rely on the AI to make sense of a huge amount of complex data that comes out of a functional MRI scan in order to then identify. And this is a great way now that we can diagnose patients and, more importantly, measure how they're doing as they respond to treatment. Much, much more sensitive and much more accurate. This is a great advancement in terms of using objective data through direct measurement in order to increase our capacity to deal with conditions like schizophrenia. In terms of behavior, there are many ways that we can monitor and measure behavior objectively. Touchscreen interactions is obviously an extremely scalable one. The way that you interact with your phone says a lot about your behavior. And I'll give an example on this soon. Written sentiment analysis. The words that you choose tell a lot about your emotional state, whether you choose one adjective for another. But the relationships between the word choices and your mood also is very difficult to ascertain with a rule-based system. But if you apply these data into a neural network, a form of AI that can then understand them, you can get outputs that are clinically and medically relevant. App use dynamics is also a very important one. So in the media, it's very commonly shown that or reported on these days that social media in particular is damaging to the mental health of youth. And that's partially true. What's actually damaging is passive use of social media, continual scrolling without the interaction. If people are interacting, they're posting on their own, you don't see this strong correlation anymore between social media use and affect disorders. And so looking in at how people are interacting with different types of programs can be very important. Another is voluntary eye movements. This is a form of behavior. Where you choose to place your attention says a lot about how you're doing. It can tell you about affect bias, for example. So for each of us, our brain has a certain threshold to identify things in our environment. And for some of us, the threshold to identify negative things is lower than it is to identify positive things. And this works in real time, as well as when you think back on your memories. Many people, like myself included, tend to forget the bad things that happened to me and remember the good ones. And that's a positive thing for my own mental well-being, but it also means that it takes me a little bit longer to learn from my mistakes. So there's something of a trade-off. But nevertheless, these things exist, and we can understand them objectively by measuring people's voluntary eye movements. Where do they put their attention? There's a really interesting study that was done with a nice pair of glasses that monitor eye movements, and they brought people into an art gallery, and they had them walk around, and they used AI to analyze the eye movements, including voluntary eye movements. And just from those data, the AI was able to predict where they would score on different psychological scales for hope and for fear and for anxiety and for overall well-being. And so there are many complex relationships that exist in our voluntary movement. Actigraphy, which is your ambulation, how you're moving around and what you choose to do, is also a good source. So a nice example of this comes from the combination of touchscreen interactions and actigraphy, where you can actually measure somebody's circadian rhythm, because if you're sleeping, you're not using your phone, and if you're awake, you're using your phone virtually every 10 minutes, 20 minutes or so. And so you get a good idea about how somebody's moving. But then also you can see how quickly they're interacting with their phone, how quickly they're able to type. And this can be a readout for your cognitive speed. And by combining these two modalities, we're then able to see very strong correlations in cognitive speed that are related to circadian rhythm and related to how much sleep people are getting. This is a good tool to measure cognitive speed, and of course, cognitive speed will always be a good early indicator of neurocognitive decline. So think of early onsets or age-related dementias. Now, the last one, and my favorite, is interoception. Saying before, how your brain uses your bodily sensations in order to understand what is going on. So there are many, many different tools that you can use here, many processes that you can examine. Heart rate and heart rate variability is something which is very commonly used. Heart rate variability has a specific relationship to psychological stress due to the connection between the autonomic nervous system to the heart through the sinoatrial node. And this relationship is very complex, but we nevertheless have known that it exists for about 5 decades. Microexpressions, particularly around the eyes, tells us a lot about how we're feeling. In fact, that's how the human brain makes judgments about how other people feel. The human brain doesn't pay much attention to a smile or a frown. It really looks at what is going on in somebody's eyes. That's the most important information that we as humans pick out about other people. That's why during the pandemic, when people wore masks, you could still tell if they were bored with what you were saying or laughing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, microexpressions are so important that we actually mimic them. So when you see somebody's expression for just a split second, you will then create that same microexpression in your own face. And it's that feedback system to your own brain, which will then tell you whether or not your guess as to what they're feeling is correct. So it's very, very important to be able to have microexpressions. And people who use a lot of Botox have an inability to create these microexpressions. And it actually contributes to an inability for them to have empathy at the usual level they would, And without the level of empathy that they usually would, they also have less of a connection with people. And this is the primary contributor to how Botox can lead to depression and senses of loneliness, because it interferes with your ability to create the micro expressions in real time as you communicate with people. So these processes are obviously very, very important. Verbal and non-verbal speech. This is very important. You can tell if somebody's tired based on how they're speaking. Maybe you can tell that I could use a little more sleep right now because I'm not articulating as well as I naturally, I'm trying to make up for it, as I would normally. But there's also these nonverbal cues, the pauses that you take, how often you repeat certain words, etc. And a lot of this can tell us not just your word selection, but how you say things, the intonations about how you're feeling. And because we hear ourselves speak, it also has a feedback mechanism for ourselves. It's a part of our interoception. Involuntary eye movements. So we talked about voluntary eye movements already, but there's many eye movements that we have which are involuntary. Those can also tell us about somebody's brain states, and we can measure these in real time. And then breathing being the last one. This is the most profound way that you can interact with your brain. The most profound way that you can connect the conscious with the subconscious, because we have direct volitional control over how we breathe. This is why parents tell their children to take a deep breath when they're having a tantrum. It works, because when you breathe slowly, that's a signal that you're safe, that you're calm. And this type of stuff we can measure in individuals as well. How quickly are they breathing? That tells us something about their particular emotional state at that moment in time. So something that we've done at Mobile Interactive is develop computer vision technology that allows us to record in real time many of these biomarkers. Here's an individual who's doing a test scan. And what we first do is we identify that there's a face. Then we use a form of AI in order to create an artificial mask on their face. And then we can extract out in real time a number of different biomarkers. We get out heart rate, beat by beat, and therefore heart rate variability. We get out breath rate, relative blood oxygen saturation. We get out a number of different pigments from the skin, bilirubin, melanin, beta carotene. And we also get out the microexpressions. So the microexpressions are made possible by looking at all the changes at the intersection points around the eyes. That's why the density of the triangles around the eyes is so high. And then finally, facial blood distribution. You know that if somebody's feeling embarrassed or a little bashful, they might get rosy in the cheeks. This rosiness in the cheeks is a differential facial blood flow distribution. But there's also some early evidence to suggest that there are many other but more subtle changes in facial blood flow distribution that may be important to understand different brain states. So we cannot just look at somebody who's bashful, but also somebody who's feeling angry or somebody who's elated, etc. Now, we've built this technology to work with essentially any camera that has sufficient resolution, and that includes smartphones. And so it's very convenient for patients to interact with this technology, to take a selfie scan of themselves. It takes 30 seconds, and we have the data processed, and we send the individual extracted biomarkers to a neural network that runs on a cloud. And I'll dive into that in a second. But the important thing here is just how scalable it is, how everybody can do it. And already, as a small company that's mostly been focused on research over the last few years, we've collected close to 500,000 of these scans from people in over 150 different countries. Very diverse group of individuals. Over 25,000 of them have completed these selfie scans. This amounts to tens of millions of unique and useful data points to train neural networks. And all of these biomarkers have been recorded in tandem with somebody's self-reports through ecological momentary assessments, or EMAs. These are kind of like micro-psychological scales. So a very quick way to ascertain, according to an individual patient, how they think they are feeling at that moment in time. And we particularly measure their stress and their mood as a self-report. And what we've done then is, using a neural network that we devised on our own, is we fed in certain biomarkers, the most important being heart rate and heart rate variability that with our own proprietary algorithms, we've broken up into two different frequency domains. And the units that are output from these for these biomarkers have been designed in order to make it easy for the neural network to interpret them. And the output of this deep neural network is an objective measurement of psychological stress. Without having to ask a patient anything, we can identify how much stress they're feeling at that particular moment in time. And that's a very powerful thing. We've, of course, tested the accuracy of the neural network, and it is substantially better than the logistic regression techniques that are currently the gold standard for estimating stress based on heart rate variability. And it shows a 30-fold reduction in the number of errors that it delivers relative to what is currently the gold standard. And so this technology is now being adopted by many hospitals around the world, and we're very happy about that. Now, why do we focus in on stress? Stress is a fantastic proxy for not just your mental, but also your physical well-being. When you break a leg, that's stressful. When you're feeling bad, that's stressful. When things are not optimal, that's stressful. And so stress can tell us a lot as a single measurement about somebody's overall well-being. And it was some of the lowest hanging fruit and something that we thought that we could do objectively. But our path is towards a more holistic understanding of the brain, a triple axis measure of brain health, where we get not just stress, but we also get the valence, how good or bad somebody feels, and the arousal, which in this case specifically refers to how strongly a patient is feeling what they're feeling. Now, we've packaged this into a mobile platform. This is how we're able to get so many people around the world to use this. We license it to health systems. It's been clinically validated. It includes this unbiased measure of mental well-being, which is very important and novel. And it has well over 1,000 different psychotherapy sessions. These psychotherapy sessions are created with psychiatrists, clinical psychologists in a recording studio so that they can be consumed by patients in a very convenient manner, asynchronously, on demand, at the time and place most convenient for them. And this gives us a really good opportunity to measure how effective the psychotherapy is on patients in real time. And the question then is, well, if we can measure it, can we then understand what works best for each patient? And more importantly, can we predict what is the right therapy for each patient? That's the goal here, ultimately, to understand what is the right the therapy for each patient. And so we have completed a prospective real-world study, and I'll go through some of the data now, which showcase the power of this approach. So on the left there, you see over time, as we continue to train the recommendation algorithm with objective stress data that comes from the AI, we're increasingly able to identify the forms of therapy that will be most clinically meaningful for the patient. And as a comparison, we did the identical experiment using the self-reports of stress and self-reports of mood. We don't see nearly as good predictive ability. So while it's true that you have a general sense for how you're feeling, you're not nearly as accurate as the neural network is, for all of the reasons I explained at the beginning of the talk. And by using the objective data, we're much more able to then make a prediction as to what will work. And in fact, after 15 therapy sessions that are measured pre and post, we are able to make recommendations that are statistically significantly better at reducing stress in patients compared to the content that they choose on their own. And patients are actually quite good at choosing content for themselves. A common form of personalization in psychiatry is to let the patient choose. Well, what we're showing here is that we can do even better than that, which is a very high bar to meet and very, very important. Of course, it's very critical to be sure that our approach here is scalable and applies. And so what we've done in this prospective study is we reduced the size of the data by 80% by randomly sampling it and then repeating the experiment over and over. And when we do this, we continue to see the same results. Much more profound predictions for how patients will respond to therapy when we use objective data compared to the subjective biased data that patients provide on their own. Now, the real benefit of this is how we're able to reduce the time to get treatment. So typically with subjective data right now, it's really months to years before we understand. Right? Particularly if you include the fact that most people sit on a wait list before they even get any treatment for a number of months. But when you start to apply objective data, and we can get this to the patient immediately, as soon as they want to see a psychiatrist or engage in some type of psychiatric or mental health service, then just in a matter of weeks, we're really able to identify what is the appropriate treatment for these patients. And we show that we have very profound impacts on them, reducing the incidence, taking people with severe depression to moderate, people from moderate to mild, and people then finally from mild to none, to fully cured. And that's obviously the goal, to do that as quickly as possible. We've worked with individuals from all over the world to do this. We've worked with hospitals all over North America and Europe, Asia, down in Brazil, and now opening up collaborations here as well in Colombia, which I'm very excited about. The platform that patients interact with is available in 6 languages already, and by the end of this year, it will also be available in Spanish, which is something that we intend to scale across Latin America to the benefit of many patients, of course. So before we break to have a little bit of a discussion, I just want to haul back to the great problem for mental health care, because problems very often can be the solutions. If you can solve the greatest problem within a domain, that really is the greatest solution. And we are truly on the cusp of an absolute transformation of mental health care, a complete transformation of psychiatry. For the first time, psychiatry will be able to join the rest of medicine in using objective data as standard practice, as being the default. That is absolutely essential for making progress in this domain. And more broadly, we know that there are many mental health comorbidities associated with other diseases. People with cancer are twice as likely to develop an affect disorder, and when they do so, it makes treating their cancer more difficult and more expensive. In fact, the degree to which a cancer patient can tolerate chemotherapy is the primary determinant as whether or not that chemotherapy will be successful. And the reason why physicians reduce their dose is because of the side effects that they can't deal with, particularly related to their mental well-being. And so the ability to improve how we treat patients and measure what is going on with them will have a huge impact, not just in mental health care, but throughout all of medicine. And that's really the overarching motivation for having objective data on how we feel. But first, of course, we have to abandon this idea that this is unknowable. For too long, we've accepted the idea that feelings are subjective. And I want to tell you that they're not. You feel the way you feel because of what your brain is doing, full stop, period. That's the case. Whether you want to believe that or not is up to you. But it's very powerful, particularly medically speaking. And when we do this, we're going to see, and we will do this because we can't afford not to, ethical, but also financial reasons, frankly. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for your attention. I managed to make it quite quick so we can have time for discussion. I really hope there are questions. I have a background in neuroscience and obviously technology. Please feel free to ask me absolutely anything that's on your mind. Thank you. Thanks. Manuel. See, he knows.
Siendo la psiquiatría una medicina, siendo la psiquiatría, siendo la psiquiatría una medicina que usa medicamentos para lograr pues, el objetivo. cómo podría, digamos, pensarse que la parte química con la que se logra solucionar algunos problemas de orden mental lograra en realidad, digamos, cambiar una pauta mental, es decir, con, a ver, ¿cómo explico? Digamos, la psicología, más bien, sí. Es que siento más seguro. Bien. ¿Ok? But, yes. Hola, hola, hola. Sí. Yes. Okay, I go to speak in English. It's false. But, porque va a ser más seguro poderle explicar, pero in French. Bien, lo que estaba diciendo es que la aplicación parece ser, aplica a asuntos de orden cognitivo, a depresión, a ansiedad y demás. La psiquiatría utiliza muchos medicamentos para lograr pues que una persona se comporte de cierta forma. ¿Cómo podría relacionarse lo que logra la aplicación con lo que ha intentado por años hacer la psiquiatría? Y quisiera también pues hacer un paréntesis ahí frente a que la psiquiatría en últimas también tiene ahí una serie de cosas ocultas frente a, no sé, generar adicciones, no sanar pautas de comportamiento, sino más bien regularlas o simplemente apaciguarlas por un instante. Esta aplicación es también algo temporal o realmente la persona que pueda acceder a ella puede obtener pues una sanidad mental. Más o menos por ahí iría la pregunta.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, I think the question is whether or not we can apply this technology to pharmacotherapy, and the answer is the main thrust of the message that I have is that the objective data, and there's not just our app as one solution, right? There's many sources of objective data out there. The answer is yes. If we can use objective data, then we can also measure how patients are responding to pharmacotherapy, which is the primary first initial tool that a psychiatrist will use. And it's far more scalable and actually cheaper than psychotherapy. So that's really the advent is to just use these tools across the board, irrespective. There are also many other techniques in psychiatry. Electroconvulsive therapy is also commonly used for severe mental illness. You can also measure how patients are doing using this technology like that. And so some of our clients don't use our psychotherapy at all. They only use a configuration of the app that contains the measurements. And they use those measurements to understand whether or not what they're providing the patients, whether it's pharmacotherapy, psychotherapy, transmagnetic stimulation, whatever it might be, is working and how well it's working. And so that's where the answer. The app is appropriate for any form of treatment. Yeah. Another question.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias. Entendemos que hay grandes profesionales que tratan a las personas en salud mental. Hay grandes herramientas tecnológicas y naturales que también entienden la enfermedad mental. ¿Cómo ayudar a una persona que tiene una enfermedad mental por algo específico? No era enfermo, no estaba enfermo, era una persona completamente normal, pero debido a un suceso específico, desvió el camino, ¿sí? Se desvió por el camino que no era. ¿Cómo entender a una persona que por algo netamente personal, una aplicación, una herramienta, un profesional puede ayudarlo?
Very interesting question. So, a lot of the focus, even with AI and mental health care, is on predicting in advance what is the right therapy for a given patient, depending on their condition. And often, a lot of historical data on what happened to the patient is leveraged in that decision. The approach that we're taking is actually much easier. What we do is we measure how patients are responding in real time to the best guess of therapy that they're first delivered. So we can get fast feedback in order to know if we should switch to a different therapy. That's really the approach that we are taking. And it's, like I said, it's much easier. Trying to predict what is the right therapy for a patient based on their genome and their patient history and stuff is an extremely hard problem that has made very little progress despite billions of dollars of investment. So we're just trying something which is theoretically and practically much easier, but it's frankly not as good, right? It'd be great to know from the very beginning what to do. But the next best thing is to know what to stop and what to continue as you're treating a patient. And that's what we've shown is absolutely possible today.
Thank you. I got a question for you. Could you explain to us what perspectives that psychiatry science has to apply artificial intelligence to analyze, guide, improve, and help medical cases on mental disorders to get good results using that special techniques with the human beings? Yes, you have to apply the intelligence, artificial intelligence in several cases of psychiatry science, how you can get a good help to the patients to get good results
So
applying that.
Yeah, the real benefit of AI is being able to understand complex systems or very complex data sets. And that can be applied in many different ways. The way that we do it is to understand the relationship between these things that we can measure biologically, the facial biomarkers, and brain states. It's an extremely complex relationship. We don't know how it works, and we don't even know what's happening inside of the neural network. We can't explain it. But the neural network has a way to solve it, the same way that our brain can solve it. We fully don't know the computational aspects of how the brain solves this problem either, but we know that the brain does it. And that's really a big benefit. But there's innumerable ways that AI can be and is starting to be applied in psychiatry, even as a therapist. Many patients feel much more comfortable speaking with a robot than they do speaking with another human, because a robot never judges. And so there's so I mean we would be here all day talking about how AI is already being leveraged in psychiatry to treat patients as well.
Hola, buenas tardes. Con base en lo que estabas diciendo ahorita, ¿verdad? Han surgido muchas soluciones o muchas aplicaciones de asistentes virtuales para apoyar el tema de la salud mental. O sea, que uno hable con un asistente virtual en una aplicación telefónica para decirle cómo me siento, cómo estoy deprimida, estoy estresada, y que esta solución me apoye a mi salud mental. En lo que han investigado, en lo que han averiguado, qué tan efectivo es, o sea, realmente qué tanto puede un robot con inteligencia artificial generativa ayudarme a mejorar o puede ayudar a mejorar la salud mental de los pacientes o de las personas que lo usen.
Yeah, there have been a few randomized controlled trials that have demonstrated the effectiveness of chatbots, particularly AI chatbots, in helping patients, particularly those with more mild symptoms. And even though you might think, well, the more mild symptoms aren't as important, because they're so much more common, it still represents a very great opportunity for us to reduce the overall burden. However, you have to be very careful because not all chatbots are created equal. So it's really difficult, I think, right now for clinicians to understand the landscape of what's available and provide a solution that they know will work for a patient. It's not taught in med school, and it's going to take some time for us to create the infrastructure. We can talk after. For us to create the infrastructure necessary to ensure that clinicians incorporate this into practice. And we've already started to build modules to train clinicians. I used to teach med school when I was in Zurich, and I'd love to really build up a whole curriculum for digital mental health care.
Hi, how are you?
Great, thank you, everybody.
Ah,
Pleasure.
Is it the
Oh,
last
one
one?
more? One more.
I think I have two questions, last questions here. Or one. Well, I have been thinking about your experience adopting those kinds of platforms in our countries, developing countries. So, how to break down barriers or cultural barriers to adopt these kind of technologies? And the final thing is how to make it accessible or how to use it in these countries. Is it a high cost, or do we have to wait I don't know, years to adopt this technology in this country?
It's a really great question and something that I'm personally very passionate about. We're beginning to do a lot of work in low income and lower middle income countries. And part of the reason that I'm attracted to this is because they have a high proportion of underserved patients, particularly for mental health care. They have a high degree of stigma still relative to more developed countries. And they have poor infrastructure. And the poor infrastructure is actually a really good opportunity. So we can go into a country like Kenya and Rwanda and quite easily work directly with their central health ministries in ways that would be impossible in the United States. Or in Canada, Singapore, which are countries where we currently license to individual hospitals. And that lacking of healthcare infrastructure means that they don't have a lot of the baggage that we have. So we're going to be able to accelerate how we introduce these things into training for clinicians, how we introduce the adoption, et cetera. And if we really do things at scale, and we try to use exclusively things like smartphones that patients already own, then we can keep the costs very, very small. So that's really the I think the great opportunity there. It might not have the greatest monetary opportunity, certainly not on a per patient basis, but I actually have a lot of hope for the lower income countries to leapfrog in many aspects how the healthcare infrastructure deals with mental illness. Also, to help with stigma, the use of objective data is very important. It's no longer you go to the doctor and this is how I feel. You go to the doctor or you at home, you do your own scans and you get an objective readout. Okay, I need some sort of treatment. It's not you making that decision. Like you don't, your leg breaks, and we're trying to get to that kind of level. People don't stigmatize you for having a broken leg. They understand that that's something that needs to be dealt with, and so I think there's massive opportunity in these markets, and they could truly leapfrog developing markets in how this type of technology is adopted at scale. I'm not sure if I answered both questions, but we can always talk afterwards. I know I'm over time already, so thank you all so much.